Hello and welcome to this delightful, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie Audiobook. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett. Adriana tugged the hood lower over her brow, guiding her mare through a winding trail crowded by tall pines. A playful breeze teased locks of chestnut hair from beneath the drab wool, but she paid little mind to appearances. "Easy now, girl," she muttered in a gentle tone, leaning forward to pat the mare's neck. Though her cloak suggested a simple traveler, her posture betrayed a regal upbringing. Straight spine, poised shoulders, and a thoughtful spark in her eyes. "Bless the daisies, you ride like you own these roads," quipped a passing woodsman, tipping his cap as he trudged by with a load of fresh logs. Adriana offered a kind smile. "My father used to say a horse is apt to mirror its rider, friend. Guess that tells y'all I'm a mite stubborn," she replied with a fleeting grin. The path opened onto a far-flung border village. She halted at the sight of wrecked cottages, scorched timbers, and townsfolk huddled in corners as if expecting another round of calamity. A child clutched her mother's skirt, eyes wide with dread. The air smelled of char and acrid smoke from farmland burned not far off, signs of lawless raids that seemed to brew trouble throughout Highvale. Adriana's heart thumped with both pity and frustration, recalling how her father, King Aemon, had hesitated to end these border skirmishes. She dismounted, boots crunching on the packed earth. "Afternoon," she called to a woman tugging at a stubborn goat tether. "I hear talk of outlaws roaming here?" The woman set her jaw, glancing at Adriana's plain cloak. "Looking for the brigands, are ya? Then you best hitch your horse quick-like. They been storming up this land for weeks. Folks say Lord Alistair's got a hand in it." Another villager chimed in, voice shaking. "He's fixin' to run his own show, and we're stuck in the crossfire." Adriana's jaw tensed. Alistair of Rowanwood. Her father's uneasy ally, rumored to stir conflict for his own gain. She forced a reassuring smile. "Y'all keep safe. There's gotta be a way to stop them." She considered revealing her rank, let them know a princess stood among them, but decided otherwise. Better to see the truth unvarnished. A wiry farmer, pant-leg torn and face streaked with soot, beckoned her closer. "You'd best head over yonder," he said, nodding toward a battered tower near the hillside. "View's real fine from the top. Might catch a glimpse of what they done to travelers passing through." Adriana thanked him, swallowed her dread, and remounted. The dappled mare snorted as they advanced toward the tower's silhouette. Thoughts pounded in Adriana's mind. Images of battle-scarred peasants, smoky fields stripped bare of crops, the hollow gaze of children left hungry. She whispered to herself, if father could see all this, surely he'd rethink his caution. A pang of guilt cut through her. Maybe she was overstepping her station by venturing out alone. Yet she couldn't bear to remain idle in Highvale's gilded halls while folks on the frontier suffered. At last she reached the tower. Vines crawled across the weathered stone, small birds flitting around the crumbling battlements. She tied the mare to a leaning post and slipped inside, stepping over broken rubble scattered on the stairs. Candlelight would have helped, but she had no wish to draw attention if unfriendly eyes were nearby. Halfway up, she paused, hearing a low voice from the base. "That your horse outside, traveler?" an old man called. She peered down and recognized the farmer who had directed her. "Yes, sir, I was told this spot has a vantage on the farmland." "Sure does," he answered, climbing up as well. Once they reached the top, he gestured to the sprawling fields, scorched in patches. Black plumes rose in the distance, marking the path of brigands. A handful of crows circled a roadside, revealing the dreadful evidence of a recent skirmish. Bodies of travelers lay sprawled, torn saddlebags and overturned carts telling the tale of violent theft. Adriana pressed a hand over her mouth, stomach twisting with grief. The farmer shifted uncomfortably, removing his ragged cap. "This ain't the first time, miss. Won't be the last either if no one does a thing." Adriana inhaled, forcing her gaze to remain steady. I aim to do more than watch. Y'all have my word on that. A sense of fierce resolve took root in her heart. Hoofbeats sounded on the road below. Raised voices echoed through the tree line, sharper this time, riling the crows into the sky. Adriana tensed. They're coming back, aren't they? The farmer wiped his brow, anxiety etched into his features. You'd better hightail it, young lady. Them scoundrels show no mercy. Without another moment's pause, Adriana gathered her cloak around her, hurried down the narrow staircase, and found her mare waiting, ears pricked, ready to bolt. She tossed the farmer a grateful nod. Stay safe, friend. I'll see to it your warning doesn't go unheard. She mounted up and urged the mare into a canter. As the village fell behind, her thoughts churned with plans. Return to Highvale, confront father, do whatever it took to shake him from inaction. Her rebellious spirit would not be stifled. I declare, this kingdom's got a bigger problem than folks realize, she whispered, voice tight with anger and sympathy both. The horizon glowed orange with the final rays of daylight, and the unseen threat of the brigands loomed close. Adriana glanced over her shoulder one last time at the battered watchtower, heart pounding with the knowledge that her impulsive journey had only just begun. The road wound through the dense forest like a snake, its uneven path hidden beneath thick roots and the creeping vines of wild ivy. Adriana urged her mare onward, the animal's hooves clopping softly against the damp earth. The air had turned thick, heavy with the scent of rain that lingered just beyond the horizon. She tugged her cloak tighter around her, the faded wool more a shield against the growing chill than a protection from the impending storm. Come on, girl, just a little further, she whispered, though her voice quivered slightly with uncertainty. Her father had warned her against venturing too far from Highvale's borders, but Adriana was no stranger to defying the rules set by her father, nor was she one to shy away from a cause she believed in. Today, she was out to see the reality of the kingdom's suffering with her own eyes, no more hearing about it secondhand, no more sitting idle in a gilded cage. Suddenly, the stillness of the forest shattered, a rustling from the bushes just ahead. Before Adriana could react, rough hands grabbed the reins of her mare, yanking her sharply to the side. Her heart leapt into her throat as she spun in her saddle to face the source of the attack. Where do you think you're going, Missy? A tall brigand, his face half covered with a ragged scarf, grinned with a flash of yellowed teeth. His comrades emerged from the underbrush, blocking her escape. They were armed, scruffy, and looked the part of men who had seen too many winters without a warm fire. Adriana's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to steady her breath. You've made a mistake, she said, drawing her small dagger from beneath her cloak. I'm not the one you're looking for. Ooh, I think you're exactly the one, the brigand sneered, reaching for her arm. Gold. Now. She sliced the dagger through the air, a sharp warning, but it was no match for the strength of the men who grabbed her wrists, forcing her down from the saddle. The dagger fell from her grip, the sharp metal tumbling into the mud at her feet. Her breath caught in her throat as they dragged her further from her mare, the cold wind cutting across her exposed skin. I'm not afraid of you, she shouted, struggling against their hold. Let me go. The brigands laughed, one of them muttering, Lady's got a tongue, I'll give her that. Another thug, with a wild look in his eyes, shoved her towards the leader. She's coming with us, he snarled, and we'll see if she still talks big when we're through. Adriana's heart hammered in her chest, but her mind raced. She had to get out of this. She wasn't a helpless girl, not in her heart, no. Not when so much was at stake. But just as they moved to bind her hands, a deep voice rang out from the shadows. That's enough. The words were barely more than a low command, but they stopped the brigands in their tracks. A figure appeared in the rain-soaked road, sword drawn, its blade gleaming in the flashes of distant lightning. The man was tall, his broad shoulders framed by the thick darkness of the storm's approach. Without a word, he lunged forward, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision. The first brigand crumpled to the ground, clutching his throat, while the second stumbled back, eyes wide with disbelief. Who? The brigand leader started, but his words were drowned by the swift arc of the stranger's sword. It slashed across the second attacker's chest, sending him stumbling to the ground in a heap. Adriana could barely process the sight. Her savior moved with a grace and speed that was almost unnatural. He didn't speak, didn't waste breath with threats or insults. He was a quiet storm of swift strikes, efficient and cold. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, her mouth open in awe. The rain began to fall in sheets, drenching them both, but he didn't flinch. "Are you hurt?" The knight, she assumed he was a knight, finally spoke, his voice low, but it held the warmth of concern despite his stoic face. His eyes, dark as the storm clouds above, flickered to her as he wiped his sword clean of blood. "No," she said quickly, straightening up, "but I—" Before she could finish, the last brigand, a hulking man with a wild look in his eyes, lunged at her. His arm swung wide, and Adriana didn't have time to draw her dagger, but her mysterious knight was quicker. In a fluid motion, he stepped in front of her, his sword flashing through the air like lightning. The brigand's body dropped with a heavy thud. Adriana blinked in disbelief as the sound of his body hitting the ground echoed in the suddenly silent woods. "Thank you," she breathed, though her heart was still racing in her chest. Her savior did not respond immediately, but she caught the briefest of glances as he sheathed his sword. His silence was almost eerie, and yet Adriana felt something stir deep inside her, an undeniable sense of familiarity. Perhaps it was the way his gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, or perhaps it was the way he moved with a quiet confidence that left no room for doubt. "Why don't you speak?" she asked impulsively, her curiosity overcoming her fear. She wiped the rain from her eyes, still shaken, but now more intrigued than afraid. The knight's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared. He bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging her question. But he remained silent, and with a single glance he mounted his own steed, urging it forward. "You should head back to your kingdom, miss," he said finally, the words slow but steady, carrying a weight she couldn't quite understand. "There are more dangers out here than you realize." Adriana hesitated, her heart torn between gratitude and an unshakable feeling that this encounter was far from coincidence. She nodded, but not before she caught the glint of something beneath his dark hood, the softest whisper of a smile. And just like that, the knight was gone, disappearing into the storm like a shadow slipping through the night. She stood there a moment longer, rain falling in torrents now, her thoughts racing. The storm had passed, but something else had begun. A spark, no more than a flicker, but one that promised to burn brighter in the days to come. "Goodbye, Sir Lucian," she whispered to the empty road, not sure why the name had come to her lips, but knowing somehow it was the right one. The storm had passed, but left the air thick with the scent of wet earth and crushed pine. The once distant thunder rumbled faintly now, as though the sky was still reluctant to let go of the chaos. Adriana stood in the small clearing, rain clinging to her hair, the wet cloak heavy around her shoulders. Her heart still raced from the harrowing moments, but now, as the world slowly returned to stillness, a different kind of unease settled in her chest. An odd sense of calm mixed with curiosity. Sir Lucian had yet to speak, though his actions had been swift and decisive. He stood a few paces away, wiping the rain from his sword with deliberate care, his dark figure cast in shadow by the last of the dying storm. The silence between them grew thick, laden with unspoken words. Adriana stepped forward, the squelching of her boots in the damp earth sounding louder than it should have. She started, her voice hoarse from the rush of adrenaline, but paused as he turned to face her. The way his eyes met hers was brief, and then, just as quickly, he averted them, resuming his task. "Thank you," she said, the words finally spilling out in a rush. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Those men—" Her voice trailed off, as if to say the words aloud would make the memory too real. Lucian inclined his head, a small movement that could have been a bow or a simple acknowledgement, but it held no warmth. His gaze was distant, the kind of look that only men who carried heavy burdens wore. His lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came. The rain had stopped, but the weight of unspoken things seemed to hang in the air between them. Adriana, still dripping, clasped her hands together, trying not to let the awkwardness of the moment take root. "I can't express how much I appreciate your help. She stopped herself, unsure of how to continue. Something in his eyes, something dark and heavy, made her want to push further, but she was unsure how to ask. "You're welcome," he finally said, his voice steady but with a tinge of something unreadable. His eyes lingered for the briefest of moments, and in that glance there was a flicker, something almost imperceptible, like a shadow crossing a distant field. She noticed it, though, the way his posture stiffened, as if burdened by more than just the weight of his sword. She shifted, uncomfortable with the tension that hung in the space between them. You don't talk much, do you?" she said lightly, trying to break the silence with a bit of humor. "Not much for conversation?" Lucian glanced at her, a single brow lifting in silent question. He didn't respond immediately, but there was a softness in his eyes, a trace of a smile barely visible at the corners of his lips. She could see it, even if he tried to hide it. Adriana couldn't help but smile in return, the corner of her mouth lifting in a playful challenge. "I suppose that makes two of us," she continued, stepping a little closer. "I prefer to listen, though it seems I've done more of the talking than I should have." He glanced away again, his jaw tightening slightly. It wasn't anger, she realized. It was something else. Something guarded, something buried beneath the surface. Her smile faltered as she caught the hint of reluctance in his movements, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of an invisible burden. "You seem troubled," she said gently, her voice softening with concern. "I don't want to be a bother, but if you've got something weighing on your mind—" "No," Lucian cut in quickly, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's not that, He paused, his eyes darting to the trees as if the answer was hidden somewhere in the darkened woods. "I'm just used to being alone," he finally finished, his words not exactly an answer, but more of an explanation. Adriana nodded, understanding more than he knew. She had always been accustomed to being on her own terms, surrounded by the grandeur of her father's court, but never quite belonging. There was a part of her that understood solitude, the kind of solitude that came from carrying one's burdens in silence. "Well," she said with a sudden burst of warmth, "if you're ever in need of company, I'm afraid you're stuck with me for now. I'd be more than happy to keep you company. For safety's sake, of course." Lucian gave a short nod, though his expression remained unreadable. "Safety's a good reason, I suppose." The corners of Adriana's lips twitched again, her instinct to break the tension with a laugh nearly overwhelming. She bit it back, sensing that the moment was fragile, that there was something about Lucian that wasn't easily cracked open. As the last raindrops fell, a silence fell between them once more, but this time it didn't feel so awkward. She cleared her throat. "You're right," she said, her tone shifting from playful to earnest. "This is no place for a lady like me to be wandering alone." She glanced toward the path, the road now darkening with the early dusk, the forest thick with shadows. "I've no wish to remain out here, not after such a fright. It's best if we travel together. Don't you think?" Lucian's gaze met hers, and for a moment, there was something like understanding there, a recognition of the unspoken plea in her eyes. He hesitated before responding, his voice quieter now. "Very well," he said at last, though the decision seemed heavy on him. "I'll accompany you." Adriana felt a rush of relief, though she tried to hide it behind her usual composure. She gave him a nod, her thoughts already drifting back to her original plan. The capital was a long way off, but the journey would be worth it. She could get back to the palace, get to her people, and learn the truth of what had been happening on the borders. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's good to know I'm not alone out here." Lucian gave a single nod, not elaborating further. They both mounted their horses in silence, the sound of hooves crunching softly against the forest path as they began to ride together. But Adriana felt a new connection in the air between them. Subtle, almost fragile, yet undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, Adriana didn't feel quite so alone herself. The towering gates of Highvale's royal fortress loomed before them, the stone walls still kissed by the soft blush of dawn. Adriana pulled her cloak tighter around her, shielding herself from the cold that had yet to release its grip on the kingdom. Her mare's hooves clicked rhythmically against the cobbled road as she approached the gates, the familiar sight of the castle's ramparts sending a mix of comfort and unease through her chest. Beside her, Lucian rode in silence, his posture as stiff as ever, his dark gaze scanning the perimeter with practiced caution. Adriana could feel his presence beside her like a quiet, reassuring shadow, but something about the stiffness in his silence nagged at her. She had noticed it ever since their departure from the woods, a faint wariness in his movements, like he carried a secret just beneath his calm exterior. "Well, here we are," she said lightly, trying to ease the tension that hung between them, though her heart still fluttered with uncertainty. "Back to Highvale. Safe and sound, eh?" Lucian didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the gates and the guards who stood in rigid formation atop the stone walls. It was the first time they had returned to the castle together since their brief escape from the storm. A figure atop the wall called down to them. "Halt! Identify yourselves!" The man squinted against the low light, his voice tinged with suspicion. The other guards stirred, weapons glinting in the early morning sun. Adriana hesitated, just for a moment. The last thing she wanted was to reveal too much. But as her heart pounded, the familiar weight of the crown and the role she had been born to fill pressed heavily on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she pulled back the hood of her cloak, her face emerging like the sun itself breaking through the clouds. Her long chestnut hair tumbled freely down her back, and her sharp hazel eyes met the guards with a mixture of defiance and determination. "Princess Adriana," she said softly, but with enough authority to carry through the morning air, "it's been a long time." The guards froze. One of them faltered, looking to the others for guidance, while others quickly scrambled down the stone steps to open the gates. Murmurs passed through the ranks like wildfire. The realization spread faster than the dawn, and soon the entire garrison stood in awe. Lucian, riding at her side, stopped his horse abruptly, his brow furrowing. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if he didn't know what to say. The truth settled like a stone in his stomach. This young woman, this fierce, wild-hearted traveler he had come to admire, was none other than the Princess of Highvale, the very daughter of the king he had sworn to protect. He glanced at her, as if seeing her for the first time, though they had been through so much together in so short a time. There was something delicate about her now, something not just regal, but vulnerable, exposed. The way her eyes flicked nervously to the castle, as though waiting for the storm of royal expectations to come crashing down upon her. Adriana smiled lightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid I've made an entrance," she said with a touch of irony, as if the situation wasn't at all out of place. Lucian remained silent, his hands gripping the reins so tightly that his knuckles were white. He hadn't meant to put her in this position. He hadn't meant to protect her, only to deliver her right back into her father's hands. She was the very heart of the kingdom, and he, the man who had ventured so far beyond his reach to rescue her, now felt as though he'd failed her in the eyes of all who watched. "Princess," he said quietly, his voice carrying no anger, but a trace of sadness. "I didn't know." Adriana met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had known, of course, that he hadn't known her true identity, but to hear him admit it left her unsettled. The truth of her status had never seemed so sharp. She was no longer just a woman seeking refuge or freedom. She was the crown's daughter, and with that came duties and responsibilities she had tried so hard to escape. Lucian's eyes softened for a moment. He looked away, clearing his throat. "I did what any man would have done, but I didn't know who I was protecting." Adriana felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest at his words. She wanted to say something, to ease the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud, but the moment was too heavy. Instead, she reached down to adjust the reins of her mare, willing her voice to steady. "Well, now you know," she said softly, though the words tasted bittersweet. "And now, I suppose, I'll be expected to return to the life I was born into. No more adventures for me, I fear." The gates swung open with a groan, and the royal courtyard spread out before them, bathed in the soft golden light of morning. As they passed through the gates, the sight of the familiar stone walls, the noble banners flapping above, filled Adriana with a sense of homecoming, but also dread. There was no turning back now. As they made their way toward the stables, Adriana's gaze drifted upward, where the royal banners fluttered in the breeze. "My father," she muttered, more to herself than to Lucian. "He'll be furious." Lucian glanced at her sidelong, unsure whether she wanted him to hear her quiet confession. "He won't understand, will he?" "Not at first," Adriana replied with a soft sigh, her eyes cast downward as she urged her mare forward. "But he'll see that this was necessary. I can't sit idle in that court any longer, pretending that everything is fine. I'm not some doll to be displayed for political advantage." Lucian's jaw tightened. "I can see that. You've got fire in you, princess." Adriana smiled at the word, the smile fleeting but genuine. "Maybe that's the problem. But I can't stop it." "Then don't," Lucian said, his voice low but resolute, the hint of a challenge in his tone. "Fire's what the kingdom needs." For a moment, Adriana looked at him, her heart swelling in unexpected warmth. There was something about him, a quiet strength, a loyalty she hadn't known she could trust, that made her feel less alone in this world of heavy crowns and burdens. With a soft smile, she nudged her mare onward. "Then let's see if we can't light a fire together," she said, her words infused with a new kind of hope. The gates of High Vale had closed behind them, but this time, Adriana wasn't looking back. The kingdom might be watching, but she wasn't going to be its prisoner. Not anymore. And Lucian, the silent knight who had brought her back when she thought she had nothing left, would stand at her side. The great doors of the throne room creaked open with a slow, deliberate groan as Adriana stepped into the familiar, yet intimidating, space. The massive stone chamber stretched before her, the ceiling arched high above like the vaulted sky. Tapestries of past victories hung from the walls, their faded reds and golds seeming to whisper tales of glory and power. The faint scent of polished wood and old parchment mingled in the air, mingling with the murmurs of the courtiers who crowded the room. Adriana's heart raced, though she had passed through these doors 100 times before. But today, things were different. Today, she was no longer just a princess in her father's eyes. Today, she was a daughter who had defied him, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her shoulders. At the end of the room, King Aemon sat upon the grand dais, his royal cloak draped across the steps. His silver hair caught the light, and his brow furrowed as his sharp eyes fixed on her. She swallowed hard, trying to steady the rush of emotion that threatened to overtake her. She had always admired her father's authority, his wisdom, but today she feared his anger more than any enemy. "Adriana!" King Aemon's voice rang out, deep and filled with the gravitas of a monarch who had seen both the heights and depths of power. "What were you thinking, daughter? What madness possessed you to venture into such danger?" His words cut through the air like a sharp blade, and the court fell silent, each noble and advisor hanging on his every word. Adriana stood tall, unwilling to shrink from the storm her actions had caused. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "Father, I could not sit idle while our kingdom crumbles at the edges," she replied, her voice steady, though her hands clenched at her sides. "You may see me as reckless, but I see it as duty. Our people are suffering, and we cannot pretend it is all well in High Vale while the borders bleed." The courtiers exchanged glances, some of them nodding in reluctant agreement while others shifted uncomfortably. But Adriana's gaze remained firmly on her father, whose expression had softened only a fraction. Still, there was tension in his jaw, a frustration he could not entirely hide. "I've seen it with my own eyes, father. The violence, the destruction, the rumors of brigands funded by Lord Alistair's men," she continued, her voice tinged with urgency. "I couldn't ignore it any longer. It is my duty to protect this kingdom, our people, and I won't stand by while men like Alistair use the suffering of our people for their own gain." A sharp silence followed her words, thick with the weight of truth. King Aemon's expression hardened again, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a flicker that resembled a father's concern beneath the crown he wore. But before he could speak, Adriana's voice rose once more, her heart pounding with a new determination. "And I was saved by this man," she gestured to Lucian, standing at her side, his posture as unwavering as ever. "This is Sir Lucian, who saved my life when I was set upon by those brigands. It was his bravery and skill that spared me. He deserves your thanks, not your reproach." Lucian bowed his head ever so slightly, his silence speaking volumes as he stood firmly at her side. The courtiers, who had been watching with a mix of suspicion and intrigue, now turned their eyes to him, whispering amongst themselves. Lord Alastair, sitting at the far end of the room, fixed Lucian with a cold, appraising look. His lips curled into a subtle sneer as he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Alastair began, his tone dripping with suspicion. "A stranger appearing from nowhere to save the princess? A bit convenient, don't you think? Where did you come from, sir? What is your true allegiance?" Adriana's chest tightened. She had anticipated this, of course. Alastair would never let such an opportunity slip by without a calculated move. But she wasn't about to let him turn Lucian into an enemy, not after all he had done for her. She glanced at Lucian, who stood silently, his face unreadable. She knew he would not defend himself. He never did. It was in his nature to remain silent, to endure the scrutiny without so much as a word. But Adriana would not let him stand there and be accused without response. "Sir Lucian's allegiance is to High Vale as mine is," she said, her voice firm, cutting through Alastair's insinuations. "He does not need to answer to you, my lord, nor does he need to justify his actions. He acted out of honor, and that is all I need to know." King Aemon's gaze flicked between Adriana and Lucian, his face unreadable. There was a long pause before he finally spoke, his voice low but tinged with a new respect. "Very well. If you vouch for him, daughter, then so be it. But I will not allow this to be the beginning of a dangerous path. High Vale's borders are in chaos, and I do not need some wandering knight stirring the pot even further." Lucian stiffened at the king's words, but Adriana could sense his restraint. He had never been one to argue, even when it was clear that the court would see him as an outsider. She gave him a reassuring glance before turning back to her father. "I trust him, father, and the kingdom needs him, now more than ever. I ask that you allow him to remain at court, to serve as a royal guard. His skills are unmatched, and his heart is loyal to High Vale." The king's brow furrowed, and he took a long moment to consider her request. The silence in the room was deafening, filled with the whispers of courtiers who wondered whether he would accept her plea. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, King Aemon nodded, though his voice held the weight of royal authority. "Very well," he said, his tone begrudging. "Sir Lucian, you may serve as a royal guard, but know this, you will answer to me, and you will not forget your place. I will not tolerate any foolishness." Lucian bowed again, his eyes lowered in quiet respect. "Thank you, your majesty," he said, his voice calm but resolute. As the court began to murmur once more, Adriana felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her father had granted her request, though his wariness still lingered. But she knew that this was only the beginning. Lucian was now bound to High Vale in a way he had never been before, and she could already feel the weight of the court's suspicion pressing in on him. Lord Alastair's eyes narrowed as he watched Lucian, and Adriana could sense the quiet storm that was brewing. The moment she had been dreading had passed, but the consequences would come, she knew it. Yet as they left the throne room together, Lucian's steady presence beside her was enough to quiet her fears, if only for a moment. They walked down the long corridor that led to Adriana's private chambers, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Her heart was still racing, but she felt the warmth of Lucian's quiet strength at her side. "Thank you for staying silent," she said softly, breaking the silence between them. "I know you don't like to speak much, but I couldn't let them accuse you without defending you." Lucian's gaze shifted toward her, and for a brief moment their eyes met, silent understanding passing between them. He said nothing, but the slightest of smiles tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You're welcome," he replied quietly, his voice warm despite his usual reserve. "You're not alone, Adriana." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that no one in the court could understand. They were bound now in a way that was both undeniable and yet fraught with challenges. But for Adriana, in that moment, it was enough. Adriana sat at the large oak table in the palace library, the musty scent of parchment and ink filling the quiet air. She had spent the better part of the afternoon poring over maps of Highvale's war-torn borders, tracing the lines of battle with her finger, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The conflict seemed endless. Every route marked with red ink, every village shaded in sorrow. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of her duty, but the weight of it all felt heavier now than it ever had before. As she turned the map toward the light, she felt a presence at her shoulder, though she did not need to look up to know who it was. Lucian, his quiet strength ever present, had entered without a sound, his gaze sharp as always, his silence a constant companion. "I can't make sense of it all," she admitted, her voice softer than usual. "Father's orders only seem to complicate matters more. These borders are more than just lines on a map. Their lives, families, future." Lucien didn't reply immediately. He was standing beside her now, his eyes scanning the map with the kind of intensity that only men of battle possessed. His hand hovered over a vulnerable stretch of land, a route to the east that had seen its fair share of skirmishes. Without a word, he pointed to the spot, then gently slid his hand to a nearby fortification. His gesture was simple, but Adriana understood at once. The route was unguarded, that much was clear, but it was also more than that. His finger traced the path with a knowledge that only someone who had lived through the chaos of war could understand. She looked up at him, surprise and respect in her eyes. "You've fought here, haven't you?" she asked softly. Lucien nodded, his expression unreadable. The air between them seemed to thicken, the unspoken history he carried with him making itself known. He leaned closer to the map, his eyes scanning the terrain, and without speaking pointed to another location further south. "I see," Adriana said, a new understanding dawning on her. "These strongholds here, they're the key. Without them, the whole region falls into chaos." He nodded once, his eyes flicking to hers for the briefest moment before returning to the map. Something in his gaze stirred a warmth in her chest. It was rare to see Lucian so open, so involved. She could feel his presence as an anchor, not just a protector. "Your insights are invaluable," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Then, as if catching herself, she added, "I don't know what I would do without your help." Lucian didn't speak, but the smallest of smiles tugged at the corner of his mouth, a subtle acknowledgement that made Adriana's heart flutter in a way she wasn't quite prepared for. His gaze softened, and for the first time since their meeting, she saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of warmth that matched the quiet trust she had placed in him. She could not help but admire the strength in him, both physical and emotional, but also the gentleness he had begun to show her. "I'm glad to be of service, Princess," he finally said, his voice low but with a touch of something more personal now. "But this is your kingdom. You've the heart to lead it." Her smile was soft but genuine. "Perhaps, but it's not easy to lead a kingdom when one's father is so far removed from the struggles of his people." She leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing the map lightly. "I wonder sometimes if he even sees what I see. The faces of the people. The ones who suffer for decisions made far above their heads." Lucien remained silent, but the weight of his gaze was enough. They were allies in more ways than one now, their bond solidifying not just through shared duties, but through shared understanding. The evening unfolded with the warmth of the great hall alive with the hum of nobles, jesters, and minstrels. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fine wines, and the air was filled with the clinking of goblets and laughter. Adriana tried her best to ignore the heavy weight of the tension in her chest. Tonight's banquet, hosted by her father in honor of a minor victory in the war, was supposed to be a celebration, but the undercurrent of politics hung thick in the air. Lucien stood silently at her side, his presence a quiet anchor in the midst of the noisy banquet. The nobles and courtiers were all busy in their own whispered conversations, but Adriana couldn't shake the feeling that many eyes were on her. Some were impressed by her resolve, others, like Lord Alistair, were more skeptical, watching her every move with barely concealed distrust. Adriana caught the glance of Lord Alistair from across the hall. His gaze lingered just a moment too long on Lucian before he leaned toward one of his companions and spoke in low tones, eyes narrowing. The words were too soft for Adriana to catch, but the disdain in his eyes was unmistakable. She straightened in her seat, her fingers curling around the stem of her goblet. She knew what this was. Alistair had always been suspicious of anything or anyone that did not fit neatly into his expectations. Lucian was an outsider to him, a foreign knight whose past and allegiances were unknown, and that, in Alistair's eyes, made him dangerous. "Must we listen to this constant stream of discontent?" Adriana muttered, her voice low but sharp as she caught Lucian's eye. "Alistair speaks as though we've invited the wolves to dine with the sheep." Lucian's lips twitched upward, but his gaze remained steady. "The wolves have their place, my lady, and I'd wager they speak louder than the sheep." She chuckled softly, grateful for the brief moment of levity. But just as she thought the tension might ease, Alistair's voice cut through the noise of the banquet. "I find it curious," he called across the hall, his eyes locked onto Lucian, "that a knight of no known origin is given such favor in the heart of Highvale. One must wonder if such favors are truly deserved." The room quieted slightly, but Adriana didn't let the words rattle her. She had known this would come, and she would not back down. Her father's gaze lingered on Lucian, though his expression remained unreadable. With a calmness that belied the growing tension inside her, Adriana set her goblet down and looked Alistair squarely in the eye. "Lucian's allegiance is to the kingdom, Lord Alistair, the same as mine, and while you may question his origins, I assure you, his loyalty is beyond reproach." The court shifted in its seat, some exchanging glances, others pretending not to hear. But Alistair's gaze never wavered from Lucian's, as if daring him to speak. But Lucian remained quiet as always, standing firm in the face of Alistair's veiled accusations. Later that evening, after the feast had wound down and the last of the courtiers had retreated to their chambers, Adriana found herself walking down a dimly lit corridor, the soft glow of torchlight dancing against the stone walls. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, and she turned the corner, nearly bumping into Lucian, who had been walking just behind her. "Sir Lucian," she said, startled but amused. "I should have known you'd be lurking about. You must find the festivities rather tiresome." Lucian gave a small smile, though his eyes held a depth of thought that she couldn't quite place. "The court can be overwhelming at times, Princess." Adriana sighed, her gaze softening as she leaned against the stone wall. "It's hard, isn't it? Trying to navigate the labyrinth of royal politics and play the part they expect. It's like walking on a knife's edge, never knowing who will strike next." Lucian's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made her heart ache. "Not everyone here is your enemy, Adriana." She turned to face him, her heart unexpectedly quickening. His words, simple and unadorned, held a promise of something more. A promise that he would stand by her even when the walls of court closed in around them. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to face this alone," she confessed, her heart in her throat. "I never wanted to be a queen of politics. I wanted to be someone who could make a difference." Lucian's smile was small but sincere, his eyes softening as he stepped closer. "Then I'll walk beside you, Adriana, whatever comes." And in that moment, the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with enemies and unknowns, but at least she wouldn't face it alone. And that was enough. For now. The soft hum of quiet voices filled the air as Adriana entered her private council chamber, the morning light casting a warm golden glow through the stained glass windows. The colors of the glass painted vivid hues across the stone floor, red and blue like fire and water, bright and beautiful but tinged with a somber note. The chamber was simple yet grand, a place of decisions that could change the course of kingdoms, but at this moment, it felt intimate. Lucian stood by the large oak table, his arms folded across his chest, a quiet presence as he surveyed the maps laid before them. He seemed almost at ease here, surrounded by maps of Highvale's borderlands and the scattered resources they were trying to save. Adriana had spent many hours in this room, poring over strategies and proposals, but today felt different. Today, it was more than just another meeting. It was an opportunity to make things right, to bring peace to a kingdom on the brink. Her advisors sat at the table, their faces lined with worry and age, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes as they listened to Adriana's plan. She had worked for days to finalize it, an outreach effort to deliver food supplies and safe passage for villagers caught in the crossfire of the battlefronts. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was a start. "Your Majesty, the roads to the Northern Territories are over," one of her advisors, a stout man named Lord Ashford, said gruffly. "How do you propose we get these supplies to them without risking even more lives?" Adriana glanced at Lucian, who had been studying the maps intently, his brow furrowed in thought. He was the one who had suggested this plan in the first place. He knew the routes, the dangers, the places where soldiers would hesitate, where they could slip through unseen. "We won't use the main roads," Adriana said, her voice firm and filled with purpose. "Lucian has mapped out a series of less traveled routes, narrow paths hidden by the forest where fewer men are likely to patrol. We'll send scouts ahead and work with the local villagers to guide the supply wagons." Lucian's gaze briefly met hers, and she saw the quiet pride in his eyes, though he said nothing. She knew he respected her resolve. She could feel it, even without his words. Lord Ashford scratched his chin thoughtfully. "A risky venture, to be sure, but it's the only way. If we can gain the trust of the villagers, perhaps we'll find the unity we need." "It's not just about food," Adriana added, leaning over the maps, her fingers tracing the path she and Lucian had marked out. "It's about showing the people that they don't have to choose sides in this war. We unite them by showing them that we can provide safety and security no matter who they're loyal to. We're their future, not their enemies." One of her advisors, a sharp-eyed woman named Lady Rowan, nodded in agreement. "You've got the right of it, Your Majesty. If you can convince the people that we care for them, they'll see the truth in it." Adriana glanced at Lucian once more, her heart swelling with gratitude for his unwavering belief in her, even when she sometimes doubted herself. She could sense the quiet weight of his approval, even if he remained silent, ever the tactician, ever the knight. "I'll speak with King Aemon," she said, straightening up and meeting her advisor's eyes. "This plan is sound, and it must be carried out swiftly. We'll need his approval to move forward, but I'm confident he'll see the need for this." The feast was lavish, as it always was when King Aemon wished to celebrate even the smallest of victories. The great hall was alive with the sounds of music and laughter, the long tables brimming with food and drink. The smell of roasted meats filled the air, and the atmosphere was vibrant with the court's usual hustle and bustle. Yet amidst it all, Adriana couldn't shake the sense of something more personal taking root. Lucian stood behind her seat, his presence quiet but constant, like the stillness of the night sky. His eyes roamed the room with a quiet vigilance, never lingering too long on any one person. Adriana, however, found her thoughts drifting toward him more than once during the evening. Each time she caught a glimpse of his profile or met his gaze, she felt a flutter in her chest, a soft, subtle pull. She couldn't quite name it, but there was something about him that made her heart race with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something more tender. Her thoughts were interrupted when Lord Alistair, ever the opportunist, leaned over from across the table, his voice carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "Tell me, Princess," he said, his eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "How do you feel about your foreign knight standing so close, playing at heroism? Is this the new face of Highvale's future? A man with no name, no honor, no history?" Adriana's grip on her goblet tightened, but her voice was steady as she turned to him. "Lucian is a knight with a great deal of honor, Lord Alistair. He has proven his loyalty and courage time and time again." Alistair raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the subtle confrontation. "Oh, I'm sure. But tell me, Princess, who is he really? Where does he come from? A man who can't even speak of his past is a man who hides something." Adriana's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her chin tilted up with the pride that she had inherited from her father. "I've seen enough of your games, Alistair. Your suspicions are misplaced. Lucian's past is none of your concern." Lucian, standing stoically behind her, said nothing, but Adriana could feel the tension in his stillness, the quiet force of his presence. Later, as the banquet began to wind down and the court slowly dispersed into quieter corners of the castle, Adriana found herself walking down one of the torch-lit corridors. The laughter of the feast still echoed behind her, but the solitude of the hallway felt like a welcome respite. As she turned the corner, She nearly collided with Lucien, who had followed her without a word. "Ah, there you are," she said, her tone lighter now, a smile playing on her lips. "I didn't mean to leave you to fend off Alistair's barbs all night. Did you survive the ordeal?" Lucien's lips quirked into a faint, knowing smile. "I've had worse," he said simply, his voice calm but with a hint of humor. "It's not the first time I've had to endure his scrutiny." She felt a warmth flood her chest at his words, a mixture of pride and something deeper she didn't quite understand. "I appreciate your silence," she said softly, "though I don't know how you stand it. His words, they were meant to provoke. It's not worth responding to," Lucien replied. "You handled it well." Adriana felt her heart flutter at the quiet praise in his words. For a moment they stood there in the dim light, neither saying anything, but everything unspoken hanging between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." Lucien gave her a glance that she couldn't quite decipher, but there was something in it. Something warm, something real. "I'm here for you always," he said simply. And in that moment, Adriana realized that no matter what the court or Alistair or anyone else threw her way, Lucien's quiet presence would always be a steadying force at her back. And as they turned to walk together into the growing night, she knew this was only the beginning of something far more important than either of them could foresee. The throne room was colder than Adriana remembered, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across the stone floors. The air was thick with the kind of silence that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. A few courtiers lingered along the edges of the room, whispers rippling through the gathered assembly like a storm gathering force. Adriana stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to steady her breath. Lucien at her side remained as still as the stone pillars surrounding them, his usual quiet presence seeming to fill the space with a weight that matched the tension in the room. His face was unreadable, his posture stiff, though she could feel the faint tremor of his restraint. King Aemon, seated upon his throne, regarded them both with a furrowed brow. His once imposing presence now seemed diminished, as though the very air around him had turned heavy with suspicion. He was not the king she had known, the father who had guided her through every trial, every decision. Today he looked every inch the monarch, torn between loyalty to his daughter and the burden of his crown. "Adriana," his voice boomed, and the room went still at the sound. "You have put this kingdom at risk. I trusted you. And yet, you've done more than merely act against my wishes. You've endangered the very lives of those you swore to protect." The words struck her like a blow, and she instinctively stepped forward, her voice rising in protest. "Father, I don't understand. What are you saying? I did what was needed. The supplies were to help the people they were meant to save." "You have not saved anyone," he interrupted, his voice sharp with a coldness she had never known. His gaze shifted to Lucien, who stood stoically at her side, his arms crossed over his chest, his face betraying nothing. "This man," King Aemon continued, "has acted in ways that are nothing short of treason." A murmur ran through the courtiers, their voices low but filled with a growing unease. Adriana's heart clenched. She turned to Lucien, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this, Lucien? You've done nothing but protect us. You're loyal, aren't you?" Before Lucien could respond, a figure moved to the front of the room. It was Lord Alistair, his long, dark robes sweeping the floor like a shadow, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, calculating sharpness. He carried a scroll, which he unfurled dramatically in the silence. "These," he said with a sneer, "are the letters that have been circulating throughout the realm, written by none other than your loyal knight. They detail secret maneuvers, disguised as plans for peace, when in fact they plot to undermine the crown." Adriana's heart dropped as Alistair read aloud from the letters. The words were unmistakable, phrases that twisted her mind into knots, that painted Lucien's actions as betrayal. Each syllable from Alistair's mouth felt like a dagger to her chest, but she refused to show the panic rising inside her. She turned to Lucien, her voice trembling but firm. "Lucien," she said, her breath catching in her throat. Tell them this isn't true." Lucien met her gaze with a quiet intensity, but still he said nothing. His eyes held hers for a moment, but they were as unreadable as ever. The silence between them grew unbearable. The court was alive with whispers now. Some looked upon her with pity, others with judgment, as though the very idea that Lucian could be guilty was a foregone conclusion. Adriana's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and with it came the crushing realization that her father, her own flesh and blood, seemed ready to believe the worst. "I never meant for this to happen," Adriana said, her voice faltering as she turned back to her father. "Father, please. This is madness. Lucian saved my life. He has nothing but loyalty to Highvale. You can't believe—" "Enough," King Aemon cut her off, his voice harder now, his gaze turning cold. "I have seen the evidence. I have heard the reports, and I cannot ignore what is before me." Adriana's knees felt weak beneath her, but she held her ground, even as the air around her seemed to close in. She had never seen her father so distant, so removed. The man who had always protected her now felt like a stranger, and that thought twisted something deep within her. But she couldn't give up, not now, not when so much was at stake. "Father," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of her words, "Lucian is not our enemy. He's been nothing but a friend to me. Please, look into his eyes and see the truth for yourself." But her father only turned his gaze away, his decision made. "Lucian," he said coldly, "you are relieved of your post as royal guard, pending further investigation. You will be placed under guard until we can determine your true loyalties." Lucian stiffened, but he did not speak. His face remained as impassive as ever, his gaze focused on the floor, though Adriana could see the faintest hint of anguish in his stance. Her breath caught in her throat. "Father!" she cried out, her voice breaking. "No, this is wrong. You can't do this." "I can, and I will," King Aemon replied, his tone final, as if no further words were needed. Palace guards stepped forward, and Lucian remained motionless as they closed in on him, binding his hands with no ceremony. The sound of the chains felt like a ringing in Adriana's ears. "Lucian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to say something. Please, speak." "This isn't you." But still he said nothing. He only met her gaze once more, a flicker of pain passing through his dark eyes, and then he was gone, led away by the guards, his back straight, his silence louder than any words. Adriana stood frozen in place, her mind reeling, her heart torn in two. The realization that her own father could turn so swiftly against the man she had trusted left her breathless. Betrayal filled the air, thick and suffocating, and yet, even as she fought against the rising tide of despair, one thing remained certain. She would not give up on Lucian. Not now, not ever. She turned to her father one last time, her voice trembling with fury and pain. "I will not stand by and let you do this to him. You'll see the truth, father. You'll see it when it's too late." In the small antechamber just off the throne room, Adriana paced back and forth, her hands wringing in frustration. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and anger. How could this happen? How had Alistair so easily twisted the truth, and where was Lucian now? Her heart ached at the thought of him in chains, of him being treated like a criminal when all he had done was protect her. She had never felt so helpless in her life. But then, the door creaked open. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the figure standing in the doorway. Lucian stood there, still bound. His gaze locked on hers, but there was nothing of the man she knew in his eyes. The distance between them had grown, and she hated it. She hated the chains that separated them, not just the physical ones, but the invisible ones that had been placed around his heart. She crossed the room in 2 long strides, standing before him, her hands outstretched. "Lucian, please, His gaze softened, just for a moment, before it hardened once more. "You don't have to defend me, Adriana," he said, his voice low, distant. "I have no defense." Her heart cracked as the finality of his words sunk in. "But I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've been loyal to me, to this kingdom. You can't just—" "I can't break my vow, Adriana. Not even for you," Lucian replied, his voice thick with regret. "The truth is buried in me, and I will not betray it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them down. "I will make this right," she said fiercely. "I'll find a way to clear your name." Lucian said nothing, only looked at her with a sad, resigned gaze before the guards pulled him away, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. And as the door closed behind him, Adriana's world shifted, the weight of uncertainty settling deep in her chest. Her father had betrayed him, and Alistair had struck first. But this was far from over. No, she would fight for him, just as he had fought for her, and she would not rest until the truth was known. Adriana stood at the tall window of her private chambers, the heavy drapes swaying ever so slightly in the breeze that stirred through the stone walls. Her fingers rested lightly against the cool glass, her gaze lost in the twilight that spread across the distant horizon, where the last traces of daylight were swallowed by the encroaching dark. The world beyond her window seemed so still, so serene, but inside turmoil roiled in her chest. She could still hear Lord Alistair's voice in her mind, could still see the smirk on his face as he'd presented the damning letter. Letters that purported to show Lucian's treachery, that painted him as a man working in the shadows against the crown. The words echoed in her thoughts like a drumbeat, relentless and unforgiving. The knight, Sir Lucian, had sought to betray his own people, to turn them against their king. Her heart twisted with each replay. The accusations against Lucian seemed impossible. He had been nothing but loyal, a protector and ally since the day they had met, but the evidence presented so coldly, so methodically, made her doubt every instinct she had once trusted. Was it possible that Lucian had been playing a game of his own all along? Had she been blind to the very man she had come to rely on? No, she thought, shaking her head as though trying to dispel the thought. It can't be true. It simply can't. She drew in a sharp breath, trying to steady herself, but her emotions were tangled. Anger, fear, confusion, all warring within her. How could she have been so naive? The night outside had deepened, the sounds of the evening murmuring in the distance, the call of owls, the rustle of the wind through the trees. But inside, the silence in her chambers pressed heavily upon her. The weight of uncertainty felt unbearable, and the quiet solitude only made the ache in her chest worse. Her fingers found the windowsill, her nails digging into the wood as if it could anchor her in some semblance of reality. If she just thought harder, if she just searched deep enough, maybe she could find a crack in Alistair's deceit, a way to expose the lie. But try as she might, the words in those letters felt so real. Could Lucian really have betrayed her? Could he have betrayed everything they had built together? Her thoughts spiraled, swirling in circles she couldn't break free from, until the sharp knock at her door startled her from the haze. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek, her throat tightening, and with a soft, "Come in," the door opened slowly. A young court official entered, bowing low. His face was familiar, though his name escaped her at the moment. He held a small piece of parchment in his hand, carefully rolled and sealed with the royal crest. "Your Highness," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "A message, in secrecy." Adriana furrowed her brow, a twinge of unease creeping over her as she took the note. Her fingers brushed against the wax seal, the weight of it pressing down on her like a secret she wasn't ready to uncover. She opened it swiftly, the words inside too urgent to wait. "All is not as it seems. Trust your heart." The letter was brief, too brief, but in its simplicity it carried a weight that made her stomach flip. She stared at the words for a long moment, her mind racing. What was this? Who had sent it? And why now? Her hands trembled as she folded the letter carefully, her thoughts a whirlwind. There was a knowing in her gut, a quiet suspicion that Alistair's machinations had gone further than she had first realized, but she had no proof. Not yet. Trust your heart. The words repeated in her mind, and for the first time since she had seen the letters, a tiny spark of hope flickered. She didn't want to believe the worst of Lucian. She couldn't. But her father's judgment was swift, and Alistair's influence over the court was not to be underestimated. Adriana's heart ached at the thought of Lucian, locked away behind cold palace walls, his fate hanging by the thinnest of threads. How could she fight for him when the whole court seemed against them? Her mind fought against the tide of doubt, but it was hard to quiet the whispers of suspicion. She turned toward her writing desk, her hand hovering over the parchment she had prepared earlier, her quill waiting. She had planned to send a letter to her father to beg for Lucian's release, But now, with the letter from the court official in hand, she was unsure of anything. The candlelight danced softly, and as the wind outside rustled the drapes again, Adriana's mind felt like it was caught in a storm. The future of Highvale seemed as uncertain as the storm clouds that gathered on the horizon. And yet, in that very uncertainty, there was something else. A connection, a bond with Lucien that refused to be broken by the weight of the court's suspicions. She took a deep breath, clutching the note tightly in her hand. "Trust your heart." The words rang clearer now, louder than before. With a decisive motion, she began to write. The next few hours blurred as the night deepened, the stars outside shining coldly through the window. Adriana finished her letter and sealed it with a resolute stroke of wax, the wax bearing her personal crest. She had made her decision. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let Alistair's lies dictate her future, or Lucien's. She would confront the truth no matter the cost. A part of her feared what she might find, but another part of her, one that had grown stronger since meeting Lucien, knew she had no choice but to follow her heart. She would not let the kingdom fall into the hands of those who would use fear and manipulation to maintain control. But as she stood there in the quiet of her chambers, her heart pounding in her chest, she couldn't ignore the feeling that her world was already slipping further away from her grasp. The kingdom was divided, and with it, her trust in those around her seemed to be slipping away. The letter from the court official, still clutched tightly in her hand, offered no easy answers. It was just a whisper, a shadow of truth, and yet it was enough to spark something inside her, a determination to fight, even when the path ahead seemed shrouded in darkness. She turned toward the door, her gaze falling one last time on the letter she had written to her father, a promise to stand beside Lucien, a plea for his release, a declaration of loyalty to the truth. With one final glance at the night sky, she stepped out of her chambers, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders, but the flame of resolve burning brighter than ever. The game was changing, and she was no longer willing to stand on the sidelines. And so, as the chapter closed, Adriana walked down the hall, uncertain yet determined. The kingdom might be more divided than ever, but with each step she moved closer to the truth, and closer to the one person she knew she could trust. No matter the cost. Lucien was still a part of her world, and together they would face whatever lay ahead. Adriana sat by the window in her chambers, the heavy drapes pushed aside just enough to let the late morning sunlight pour in, casting warm golden beams across the floor. The light seemed to hold the promise of clarity, and yet, as her fingers traced the edges of the note in her hand, a knot of uncertainty twisted in her gut. "All's not as it seems. Trust your heart." The words were simple, but they weighed heavily on her, each syllable echoing in her mind like a riddle that needed to be solved. She had read them over and over as though hoping for some new revelation to present itself. But so far, no new answers came, only the ever-present shadow of doubt. Beside her, the forged letters that had sealed Lucien's fate lay scattered on the table. She picked one up again, her eyes narrowing as she ran her fingers along the paper. The strokes of the ink seemed almost too perfect, too deliberate. It was too neat, too clean for someone like Lucien, who spoke only in action and not in the flowery, suspiciously polished language of traitors. Adriana's breath caught as she compared the handwriting to a note Lucien had written to her not long ago. The letters were close, but there was something small, almost imperceptible, that set them apart. One curve in a letter was sharper, a cross too bold in the wrong place. It was faint, but unmistakable once she noticed it. These letters had been forged. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread. She could feel the weight of the truth beginning to shift, like a cloud parting for the first time in ages. Lucien hadn't betrayed her. He hadn't betrayed the kingdom, but someone had made sure he would appear guilty, and the man responsible for that was none other than Lord Alistair. Her hand clenched around the letter. She had to act. The danger had never been clearer, but how could she do so without arousing suspicion? The castle was a tangled web of deceit and lies, and Alistair had his fingers in every part of it. She looked back down at the note that had come into her hands so mysteriously. The words seemed to pulse with the promise of salvation, But Adriana knew the truth would require more than just hope. It would require cunning, and most of all, silence. Later that afternoon, Adriana moved quickly and quietly through the halls of the castle, keeping to the shadows. She had to be careful. Alistair's spies were everywhere, even in the most unlikely places. As she neared the servants' quarters, her heart quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. A flickering torch illuminated the narrow corridor as she approached the small door at the end, where a minor court official awaited her. She had seen him often enough, a man whose face had never stood out among the crowd. His role was small and his loyalties unclear, but when he had passed her that covert note, Adriana had felt something shift, something that said he might know more than he let on. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open, and the man, his face shadowed by the dim light, stepped inside. "Lady Adriana," he greeted her, his voice low and wary. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Adriana said quietly, her eyes scanning the hall behind her to make sure they were not followed. "But I need your help. I need to know the truth. Tell me what you know about Lord Alistair." The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. I've seen things. Things I shouldn't have. Lord Alistair's men, they'd been forging those letters, the ones that accused Sir Lucian. I watched them. They made sure everything was perfect, down to the smallest detail." Adriana's heart skipped a beat. The man's confession confirmed her suspicions, but it also brought a new wave of fear. "And what else? What else have you seen?" The official looked around nervously, lowering his voice even further. "There's more. I've heard talk," whispers, "about a private militia he's been raising. It's not just about the letters, Your Highness. Alistair has been plotting for a long time. He's been preparing for something bigger." The weight of the words hit Adriana like a blow to the chest. Her mind raced as she processed the enormity of the betrayal, both within the castle and outside its walls. This was no longer about Lucian's innocence. This was about the future of the kingdom. Alistair wasn't just trying to frame Lucian. He was trying to take control of Highvale, to tear it apart from the inside out. "I need proof," Adriana said, her voice tight with determination. "I need you to help me gather the evidence we need to expose him." The court official swallowed hard, fear in his eyes. "It won't be easy, Lady Adriana. Alistair's reach is far and his allies are many. If you're not careful, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of a blade." Adriana's jaw tightened. "I won't be intimidated. I will not let him destroy what's left of this kingdom." The official nodded, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and respect. "I'll help you, but you must tread carefully. Alistair is watching." Later that evening, after the shadows of the day had lengthened into the quiet darkness of night, Adriana found herself in the castle's small chapel, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off the stained glass windows. She had always found solace here, among the quiet prayers and the serenity that came with the flickering light. She sank to her knees in front of the altar, her hands clasped tightly together. She had never felt so lost, so uncertain. The weight of her father's mistrust, of Alistair's scheming, and of her own heartache bore down on her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "Give me the strength to do what's right, to protect those I love, and to save Highvale from the lies that have poisoned it." Her thoughts turned to Lucian, his quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty. He had stood by her when no one else would, and now she would stand by him. She wouldn't let him fall because of Alistair's twisted web of lies. She couldn't. As the candlelight flickered, Adriana felt a surge of resolve fill her heart. She wouldn't wait any longer. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost, no matter the danger. "I will free him," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet strength that surprised even herself. "I will expose Alistair and save the kingdom." With a final steadying breath, she rose from her knees, her heart brimming with determination. The battle ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She had her allies, and she had the truth, and that, she knew, was all she needed. As the chapel doors closed softly behind her, Adriana stepped out into the dim corridor, her path clear. The first seeds of hope had been planted, and the fight for Lucien's freedom and for the kingdom's survival had only just begun. Adriana's steps echoed softly against the damp stone as she approached the dungeon. The air grew colder the deeper she descended, the stench of mildew and decay clinging to the walls. It was a place she had never wished to visit, yet here she was, drawn by the need to see Lucien. The cold weight of guilt had settled in her chest ever since her father had placed him under guard, and it had only grown heavier with each passing day. The guards had their eyes fixed elsewhere, just as they always did, as if they couldn't care less about the prisoners held within the dank cells. Adriana had learned to slip through the shadows unnoticed, her movements quiet and purposeful. She approached Lucien's cell, a single torch flickering near the entrance, casting long shadows that danced against the stone walls. Inside, Lucien sat against the cold stone floor, his arms resting loosely at his sides. His eyes met hers when she stepped forward, a mixture of surprise and gratitude washing over his face. He hadn't expected her. No one but the guards dared to visit him, and she knew the isolation must be gnawing at him. Adriana set the small bundle of bread and cheese on the stone bench just outside his cell. She caught the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he shifted as if trying to stand, but still he remained silent. She hadn't expected words. He had spoken since the day he was taken into custody, but she knew he was no stranger to the weight of silence. "Lucien," she said, her voice soft, the words barely more than a breath. "I'm sorry this is happening. I should never let them accuse you." She paused, feeling the ache in her heart, that familiar tug when she saw him like this, locked away, distant. She'd been so certain of his innocence, and yet she had allowed her father's word to be the final one. "I'll fix this, I promise." She moved closer, resting her hand against the cold bars, though a part of her wanted to step inside and offer more than words. She wanted to hold him, comfort him, but the chains between them were more than just metal. They were built of all the lies and betrayals that surrounded them. Lucien, slowly, deliberately, reached out and placed his hand over hers, the gesture simple but meaningful. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her. His fingers squeezed hers gently, and though his silence was as unyielding as ever, she could feel his gratitude in the touch. He may not speak, but she knew he understood. He trusted her, and that trust felt like a heavy burden, one that she wouldn't betray. The sound of boots on stone reached her ears, too quick, too sharp. The guards were coming. Adriana quickly drew her hand back, as if the contact had burned her. She cast one last look at Lucien, his expression unreadable, but his eyes spoke volumes. The silent plea was there, the hope that she would fight for him. She didn't waste another moment. The door to the dungeon creaked open, and she stepped out into the dim corridor, her heart racing as the footsteps of the guards grew loud. She ducked around the corner, her breathing shallow. She had to get out of here, had to make it back to the safety of her chambers before anyone noticed her absence. But as she rounded the corner, a soft voice, low and strained, broke through the silence. "Adriana." Her heart stopped. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing at the threshold of the cell, was Lucien. His face pale, his hair disheveled, but there was something else in his eyes. Desperation. A quiet, desperate yearning that tugged at her soul. "Lucien?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I must tell you," he began, his voice a hoarse rasp, the first words she had ever heard him speak. His voice was as soft as a whisper, raw with emotion. "I cannot stay silent anymore." Adriana's pulse quickened, her eyes wide as she tried to process the weight of his confession. "Lucien," she breathed again, stepping closer, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you mean? You've been silent for so long. Why now?" Lucien closed his eyes, his hand resting against the cold stone of the bars as if seeking strength. "My silence. It is not just my vow," he said, his voice low, his words careful. "It is my penance. My family was wronged by your father's court. They took everything from us, and I vowed I would not speak until I could redeem our honor." Adriana's heart stuttered in her chest. The words hit her like a blow, and for a moment, she didn't know whether she wanted to run away from them or reach out and hold him close. Her father? She had known the court was filled with intrigue and corruption, but the thought that her own family had been involved in Lucian's suffering, his family's ruin, left her reeling. "You're telling me your silence is a vow to avenge your family?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper, the weight of the truth heavy in the air between them. "And you've been waiting all this time?" Lucian nodded slowly, his expression strained. "I could not speak. Not until I had the chance to make it right." A pang of guilt gripped her heart. Her father, her kingdom. She had never imagined the pain that lay just beneath the surface of Lucian's quiet exterior. All the while she had thought him distant, reserved, but in truth he had been holding on to a pain so deep that silence was the only way he could bear it. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I had no idea." Lucian looked at her then, his eyes soft but filled with the kind of sorrow that only years of suffering could cultivate. He stepped back, his body tense, but he gave her a final, quiet glance before the sound of the approaching guards drew nearer. "You must leave," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "They'll hear us." Adriana nodded, her heart heavy in her chest. She couldn't bear to leave him like this, to let him go back to that cell without answers, without hope. But she had to, for now. "I will make this right," she said fiercely, her voice laced with a determination she had never known before. "I swear it." And with one last lingering look, she turned and slipped into the shadows, the weight of his words settling in her heart. As she made her way down the hall, her mind was spinning with new questions, new revelations. She had learned more about Lucian in that moment than she had in all the months they'd spent together. And now, with the truth of his past heavy on her shoulders, she knew that her next steps would be fraught with danger. But she would not back down. Not now. Not when Lucian's family, his honor, and his silence demanded justice. She would face her father, face the truth, and fight for the man she had come to trust, no matter the cost. In the secluded storeroom near the dungeon entrance, Adriana stood alone, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She could feel the weight of Lucian's past pressing on her chest, could see the path ahead stretching out before her, uncertain and fraught with peril. But she was resolved. She would not let Alistair's lies and her father's ignorance keep her from what was right. The truth would come to light no matter how deep the shadows ran. The old stone walls of the hidden chamber groaned in protest as Adriana pushed open the heavy door. The grand library above had always been a place of knowledge, but this room, hidden away behind a false wall of bookshelves, was where secrets were kept. The air was thick with the musty scent of forgotten history, and the room itself was a jumble of neglected scrolls, faded ledgers, and crumbling parchment. Adriana's heart pounded as she stepped inside, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. She moved past piles of old records, each one a remnant of Highvale's past, lands gained and lost, alliances forged and broken. But today, she wasn't searching for just any scrap of history. She was searching for proof that would free Lucian and expose the treachery that had bound him to silence for so long. Her fingers skimmed over the faded spines of old books and the brittle edges of scrolls, her eyes scanning for anything that might hold the key. Time seemed to stretch as she shifted through dusty piles, every document she touched adding weight to the tension already coiling in her chest. She was beginning to fear she would find nothing. What if she couldn't uncover the truth? What if everything Lucian had endured was in vain? Then her fingers brushed against something different. A ledger that seemed older than the rest, bound in weathered leather with gold letters that had long since faded. She pulled it from the pile and carefully opened the first page. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the entries. These weren't the usual records of Highvale's trade or agricultural accounts. No, these were the details of land seizures. Land taken from families who had been loyal to the crown, land that had been wrongfully claimed, sometimes with no more than a signature and a lie. Her eyes darted to a familiar name. Alistair. The ink on the page blurred as she traced the letters with her fingers. The names listed beside the lands were those of Lucian's family, his ancestors, the ones who had fought for Highvale and been rewarded with their estates. But now, those lands were gone. And the man who had been behind the whole scheme was none other than Lord Alistair, the very man who had woven his web of lies and deceit around Lucian. Adriana's heart pounded with a mix of fury and sorrow. Each word she read felt like another betrayal. Her hands clenched around the ledger as the truth hit her like a blow. Lucian had been wronged by her father's court, and Alistair had been the mastermind behind it all. He had used his position to manipulate, to steal, and now he was using that same power to destroy the man Adriana had come to trust, to love. "Damn you, Adriana," she whispered under her breath, her fists shaking. "I will bring your lies to light." The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the courtyard. Adriana stepped out onto the turret balcony, the breeze carrying the faint scent of flowers from the garden below. Guards stood at a distance, their eyes scanning the courtyard, but Adriana wasn't concerned with them. Her mind was elsewhere, on the pile of documents she had discovered in the hidden chamber, on the truth that was finally beginning to unravel. She didn't expect company, but when she heard a voice behind her, her heart skipped a beat. "Princess Adriana," came the soft voice of a nobleman, his figure emerging from the shadows. It was Lord Harrow, a man whose face was familiar but whose allegiances had always been murky. He was one of the quieter courtiers, often seen in the background of royal affairs, his presence never particularly striking. But today there was something different in his demeanor, a nervous edge to his movements, a sense of urgency in his voice. Adriana turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "Lord Harrow, what brings you here?" He glanced around quickly, ensuring they were alone before stepping closer. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands shaking as he extended a small bundle of papers toward her. "I've been told to deliver this to you," he said in a low voice, his gaze flickering toward the guards. "But it's not just a message, it's—" He hesitated, his voice lowering even further. "It's proof. Alistair, he's been strong-arming me. His men forced me into helping with the forgery. I had no choice." Adriana's heart raced as she took the papers from his trembling hands. She scanned the contents quickly, her eyes widening as she read the incriminating documents. These weren't just plans for forgery. They were detailed reports about Alistair's private militia, his attempts to raise an army in secret to topple the crown and take the kingdom for himself. "He's been building an army," she breathed, her voice shaking with disbelief. "And you're saying you've been helping him?" Lord Harrow nodded, his face pale. "I never wanted to be part of it. But when Alistair's men came to me, I had no choice. They threatened my family, my lands. His voice broke, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Please, Princess, you have to stop him. You have to stop this." Adriana felt a pang of sympathy for him, but the weight of the documents in her hands pressed heavily on her conscience. "You've done the right thing now," she said, her voice firm. "But I'll need you to swear secrecy. If Alistair finds out you've given me this, it will mean the end for you and your family." Lord Harrow's gaze was desperate, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes as he nodded. "I swear, Princess, whatever happens, I'm with you now. I'm with the truth." Adriana looked at the papers, her mind racing. She had what she needed, the evidence that could finally expose Alistair's treachery and clear Lucian's name, but there was still so much left to do, so much danger in revealing what she had learned. The web Alistair had spun was far-reaching, and she knew that even with this new ally, it wouldn't be easy to confront him. "Thank you, Lord Harrow," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You've given me the tools I need to expose him. But you must leave now. If Alistair knows you're involved, he'll have you killed without a second thought." Lord Harrow gave a final shaky nod before quickly disappearing into the shadows, leaving Adriana alone with her thoughts. Her heart still pounded in her chest, the weight of the decision she now had to make pressing heavily on her. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to sit back and let Alistair's plot destroy everything she had worked for. Later that evening, Adriana walked down the narrow corridor that led to King Aemon's private chambers, the faint lamplight casting soft shadows on the carved stone walls. She had the evidence now, everything she needed to confront her father. But as her steps echoed in the silence, fear gnawed at her. Would he believe her? Or would he side with Alistair as he always had? She reached the door to her father's chambers and paused, her heart heavy with doubt. What would this do to her father? To their family? She wasn't sure she was ready for the answer, but there was no turning back now. She had to fight for Lucian, for her kingdom, for the truth. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the cool door handle. With one final, steadying breath, she knocked. And as the door creaked open, she stepped inside, knowing that everything she revealed tonight could change the course of Highvale's future forever. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as she approached her father's private study. The grand wooden door, adorned with the insignia of Highvale, loomed in front of her like a barrier she wasn't sure she could cross. Inside this room were relics of a time when her father's rule had been unchallenged. Trophies, war banners, and the mementos of battles won, all reminders of the power and respect that had once been his. But today, the walls seemed to close in on her, and each step she took felt heavier than the last. She took a breath, steadying herself, before knocking softly. The response came almost immediately, gruff but familiar. "Come in, daughter." The study smelled of leather and old parchment. King Aemon sat behind his desk, his broad shoulders hunched slightly over a pile of scrolls, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't look up at first, but when Adriana entered, his eyes lifted from the documents with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, something that spoke of the tension hanging in the air between them. Adriana didn't waste any time. She crossed the room quickly, her steps sure and steady. She placed the bundle of documents, her father's betrayal, Alistair's schemes, the injustices done to Lucian's family, on the desk between them, a heavy thud marking the weight of what she was about to reveal. "I have proof, father," she said, her voice unwavering. "Proof that Lucian's family was wronged by your court. By Alistair. These are the records, the land seizures, the lies that have been told." King Aemon's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the documents. His hand hovered above them, but he didn't reach for them, his gaze growing colder with each passing moment. "What is this?" he asked, his voice taking on a harder tone. "You bring me these accusations with no regard for the consequences?" Adriana stood tall, refusing to back down. "The consequences, father, are already here." Lucian's silence, his suffering. "It's all because of Alistair's greed and your refusal to see the truth. These are your people. Your kingdom. How long will you turn a blind eye?" Her words hit him harder than she had intended. He flinched, a brief flicker of guilt crossing his face before it was quickly masked by pride. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his jaw tightening. "I know the rumors, Adriana," he said slowly, his voice low. "I've heard whispers of these things for years, but rumors are one thing. Taking action? That's another matter entirely." Adriana's heart ached. "You knew." He paused, his gaze distant, almost haunted. "I did, but I was a king, and a king's duty is to his kingdom first. I could not afford the turmoil that would have come with opening that door. It's easy to look back now and see where I failed, but in those moments, I did what I thought was best." Adriana's fists clenched at her sides, and she stepped forward, her voice rising with the fury she had held in for so long. "And what of Lucian? What of his family? What of the injustice you allowed to stand because of your pride?" King Aemon stood then, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, his face now a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the weight of the crown is not light, Adriana. You do not understand the sacrifices I've made, the choices I've had to make for the good of the realm." Adriana's chest tightened. "But those choices have cost people their lives. Your decisions have cost Lucian his future, and now Alistair." She trailed off, her words faltering as she realized how far the corruption had spread. "Enough," King Aemon said sharply, raising his hand to silence her. "I understand the weight of this, more than you know. But you cannot undo the past." Before Adriana could respond, the doors to the study burst open with a loud crash, and the figure of Lord Alistair strode into the room, flanked by 2 armed men wearing his crest. His sharp features were twisted into a grin that chilled her to the bone. "Well, well," Alistair sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "What have we here? The royal family, at odds with each other over a few misplaced pieces of paper?" Adriana's blood ran cold as Alistair's men took up positions on either side of the room. "What do you want, Alistair?" King Aemon demanded, his voice strained with both fury and resignation. Alistair's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "I want what's rightfully mine," he said, his tone dangerously calm. "And what I want is control of this kingdom. I intend to dethrone you, Aemon, and place a more malleable ruler on the throne." Adriana's stomach churned as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about Lucien or his family. This was about power. Alistair's thirst for it, his willingness to destroy everything for it. "You think you can take the throne from me?" King Aemon's voice was cold, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. "You would betray your own king for power?" Alistair's laugh echoed in the chamber. "Betrayal? No, your majesty. This is a business deal. You see, I've been patient, waiting for the right moment. And now, the kingdom is ripe for the taking. With your weak leadership, your fractured realm, it's only a matter of time before someone else comes along to finish what I've started." He turned his eyes to Adriana then, his gaze dark with contempt. "And as for you, princess, meddling in matters you cannot understand. You've done enough damage already. You've placed your trust in the wrong people, and now you will pay the price." Adriana stepped forward, her chest heaving with a mixture of anger and fear. "You will not win, Alistair. I have the truth on my side. I will expose you." Alistair smirked. "Truth? Your father already knew the truth, and he did nothing. What makes you think your crusade will end any differently?" At that, the room seemed to freeze. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to her father, her gaze pleading. She had hoped for some kind of resolution, some show of strength from him, but all she saw was the weight of years of decisions crushing him. King Aemon stood motionless, as if trapped in a cage of his own making. Alistair's men shifted, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "The time for talk is over," Alistair declared, his eyes gleaming. "I have the power now. I have the loyalty of the court, the guards, and soon I'll have the throne. Your fate, Aemon, is sealed." King Aemon's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white with strain. "You've overplayed your hand, Alistair," he growled, his voice thick with rage. "You'll regret this." Alistair's lips curled into a smile as he stepped closer to Adriana. "I already have the kingdom in my grasp, Your Highness, and when I'm done with your father, you'll be next." As the tension in the room reached its peak, Adriana's heart raced. She had to act. There was no turning back now. Lucien's fate, her father's rule, and the future of Highvale all hung in the balance. With her father's fate and her own resting on her shoulders, Adriana made a silent vow. Alistair would not win. She would stop him, no matter the cost. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as the castle seemed to explode around her. The sound of clashing steel and shouts echoed through the stone halls, a symphony of chaos that she had never hoped to hear within these walls. The royal guards, loyal to her father, had been taken by surprise. But Alistair's men, emboldened by their numbers and the whispers of rebellion that had stirred in the shadows, now filled the corridors, sweeping through the castle like a tidal wave. Their iron boots echoed in the hallways, their dark crests gleaming in the torchlight. As they fought to control the castle, Adriana's breath caught. She had to move. There was no time to think, no time to waste. If she hesitated for even a moment, Lucien would remain imprisoned. Her father, too, was at risk. She couldn't stand by while Alistair's forces overtook Highvale. In the chaos, no one noticed her slip into the side corridor, her steps light but purposeful. She had made it this far undetected, but every second felt like an eternity as she approached the cells. The air smelled of wet stone and damp earth as she reached the heavy iron door. The guards stationed nearby were busy with the fighting, distracted enough for her to take her chance. She knew where Lucien was held, his cell, a few twists and turns deeper into the castle's bowels. The sound of clashing swords grew louder, mingling with the rising panic outside, but Adriana's mind was fixed on only one thing: Lucien. With a trembling hand, she took hold of the iron bars, the cold metal biting into her palm. The key to his cell, her father's, surely, was a mere breath away from her grasp. but it was not there. Alistair's men had taken over the main corridors, and she couldn't afford to be seen. "Lucienne," she whispered, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. She knew he'd hear her. There was a shuffling sound from within, then the low creak of chains as he moved toward the bars. "Adriana," his voice, soft but clear, filled the empty space between them. "What are you doing here?" She swallowed hard, feeling her chest tighten. "I'm getting you out of here." He said nothing in return, but she heard the faintest sound of his shackles scraping against the stone floor as he stepped closer. It was almost as if he didn't quite believe it himself. Reaching through the bars, Adriana fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling as she fought the growing panic within her. If she failed, if she couldn't open the cell, Lucian would remain trapped in this prison and the kingdom would fall into Alistair's hands. No, she thought, not today. The lock clicked open. The door creaked as it swung wide, and there he was, Lucian, standing in front of her, his face a mask of calm. He wasn't looking at her with fear or relief, but with quiet gratitude. She could see the strain in his eyes, though. He had been in here far too long. "You're free," she breathed, reaching out to him. Lucian didn't speak, but as he stepped out of the cell, he gently cupped her hand in his touch warm and solid. There was something comforting in the silence between them, a shared understanding of what was at stake. "You can't stay here," Adriana whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "The castle is in turmoil. We have to move now." Lucian nodded once, his eyes scanning the hallway, the weight of every moment pressing on him. The sound of the fighting was louder now, the shouts and clashes of steel growing nearer. They didn't have time to linger. Without a word, Lucian stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of the sword that had been stripped from him at the time of his capture. He was every inch the warrior she had come to respect, his silent resolve speaking louder than any words. They moved swiftly through the winding hallways, dodging patrols and slipping past the chaos outside. But as they approached the grand corridor, they encountered pockets of Alistair's men, their dark figures lit by the flickering torchlight. One man lunged at them from the shadows, but Lucian was quicker. His blade moved like a snake, slicing through the air and striking with precision. The man crumpled to the floor, a low groan escaping his lips. Adriana's breath caught in her throat as they continued to move. She'd never seen Lucian fight with such ferocity. His focus was unwavering, his every step and action guided by a singular purpose: to protect her, to protect the kingdom. Another wave of soldiers appeared, but Lucian moved swiftly again, blocking a blow aimed for Adriana's side, knocking the man aside with a well-placed strike. "Stay behind me," Lucian murmured, though his tone was soft, as though this were second nature to him. Adriana didn't hesitate. She'd fought by his side before, and though her heart raced in her chest, there was something in his steadiness that gave her strength. Together, they cut through the chaos, moving like a pair of shadows in the night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silent combat, they reached the exit. The door to the outer courtyard was just ahead, the night air fresh and cool as it beckoned them to freedom. But as they reached it, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Alistair's men were closing in. "Not so fast!" Alistair's voice rang out from across the courtyard, sharp and bitter. He had followed them, of course. A wolf always hunts its prey. Adriana glanced back, meeting Lucian's eyes. There was no fear there, only determination. "Go," Lucian said, his voice low but urgent. "I'll hold them off." "No," Adriana protested, stepping closer. "We leave together." His eyes softened, just a flicker of warmth passing through the storm that had built between them. "It's the only way." Adriana hesitated, but she knew he was right. The castle was lost to Alistair, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. She could see it in Lucian's eyes. They weren't running away. They were standing firm, ready to fight for the future of Highvale. With one last glance, she turned, and together they sprinted into the night, the castle behind them a dark silhouette against the evening sky. Alistair's forces might have won the battle for now, but the war was far from over. As they disappeared into the shadows, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them. But they would face it together, united, strong, and resolute. The final confrontation was coming, and Adriana knew with certainty that this time they would not be caught unprepared. The dawn light barely touched the earth, but already the barracks courtyard was alive with a nervous energy, the quiet hum of soldiers preparing for battle. The morning dew glistened on the sharpened edges of swords and armor, each piece catching the light like an offering to the coming storm. It had been days since Adriana had stood before these men, but now her heart steadied as she approached the front line, the weight of leadership falling squarely upon her shoulders. Lucian stood beside her, as ever silent, but his presence was a steadying force. His eyes scanned the soldiers before them, not with the calculation of a strategist, but with something more personal. Recognition, perhaps. These men were as much a part of his family as they were hers now, bound by loyalty to Highvale, to their people, and to the kingdom they loved. Adriana cleared her throat, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. She hadn't been born for moments like this, but the kingdom needed her. Lucian had come into her life when she'd least expected it, his strength and silent resolve pulling her forward even when she thought there was nothing left to fight for. "Soldiers of Highvale," she called out, her voice ringing out across the courtyard. It wasn't just the knights and lords who stood before her, it was the farmers, the blacksmiths, the men and women who had risked everything for the kingdom. She saw their faces, weathered and hardened by years of toil and hardship. "You have fought for this kingdom before, and you will fight again today. But this time, it's not just for your king. It's for your homes, your families, for the truth." She paused, feeling the stir of anticipation rising among them. Lucian stepped forward, his presence quiet but commanding, and for the first time he spoke. "I am Sir Lucian of Highvale," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "My family was once betrayed by the crown, by the very men who now seek to destroy our land for their own gain. My silence was not a vow to protect those who wronged us, it was a vow to protect you, to protect the kingdom." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Adriana's heart swelled with pride as Lucian's voice carried across the ranks. This was a man who had known pain, betrayal, and sacrifice, and now here he stood, a knight leading them all. "My family," he continued, "was stolen from us by those who now wear the crest of Alistair, and though I have sworn silence for years, I will not remain silent while our people suffer. I stand before you not as a stranger, but as a man who knows the weight of what is at stake. We will reclaim this kingdom together." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of surprise, respect, and solidarity. The knights stepped forward first, their swords raised high in salute. One by one, the peasants followed, their faces set with determination. Adriana felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment they would all stand together. "We will fight for Highvale," she cried, her voice stronger now. "For justice, for freedom, for Lucian's family, for your families. No one will be left behind." The cheer that erupted from the soldiers, peasants, and knights alike was like a wave crashing against the shore, shaking the very earth beneath them. In that moment, the bond between them was sealed. They were no longer divided by rank, by birth, by history. They were united, and together they would take back their kingdom. By midday, the city gates stood open, the banners of Alistair's army fluttering on the horizon. A grim, oppressive silence hung in the air as Alistair's forces began their siege. Arrows flew, the hiss of the projectiles slicing through the air like the breath of death itself. Catapults roared to life, sending massive stones crashing against the castle's ramparts, shaking the earth beneath them. Adriana stood on the castle wall, her heart racing as she surveyed the battlefield. Lucian stood beside her, his eyes sharp, his grip tight on the hilt of his sword. They were ready, but the siege had only just begun. She glanced at Lucian, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "We hold our ground here," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We will make them pay for every inch they take from us." Lucian nodded, his jaw clenched tight as he surveyed the field. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'll lead the cavalry charge when the time comes, trust me." "I do," Adriana replied simply, her eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding that spoke volume. They had fought together before, and she knew, without a doubt, that they would fight together again today, and this time they would win. The first wave of Alistair's soldiers reached the walls, their screams echoing through the air as they clashed with the royal guards. The battle erupted in a frenzy of steel and blood, the sound of swords meeting flesh and shields ringing out like the thunder of war. Adriana's breath caught as she took her place beside the soldiers, her command ringing out over the battlefield. "Hold the line! Do not let them breach the gates!" she cried, her voice carrying above the noise. Lucian moved like a force of nature, his cavalry charging with unmatched speed, cutting through the enemy ranks. His sword moved with deadly precision, each swing carving a path through Alistair's men. His skill was unmatched, a display of both power and grace, and it left Adriana in awe. The battle raged on, the clash of weapons deafening as both sides fought for dominance. But as the hours stretched on, Adriana could see the tide turning. Alistair's forces were losing ground. The royal army, once on the defensive, was now pushing forward with renewed vigor, their spirits lifted by the presence of their leaders and the truth they had all come to believe in. Then a shout rang out from the front lines. Alistair's forces were retreating, falling back to the outer courtyard. The gates had been breached, but their victory was still within reach. Adriana's pulse raced as she watched the enemy retreat, their banners falling behind them like the dying remnants of a storm. The smoke of battle hung thick in the air as Adriana and Lucian made their way toward the castle courtyard. The bodies of the fallen littered the ground, a testament to the brutal fight that had just taken place. But Adriana's focus was on one thing, one man: Alistair. The final confrontation was close now. She could feel the weight of it in her chest. The knowledge that everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, was leading to this moment. Lucian stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his gaze locked on the outer courtyard where Alistair had retreated. Adriana followed, her breath steady, her mind clear. Together, they would face him. As they approached the courtyard, the doors loomed before them, dark and silent. The remnants of Alistair's men were scattered across the ground, but his true power lay behind those walls. Adriana exchanged a look with Lucian, a silent promise passing between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And with that, they stepped forward into the courtyard. The final clash for Highvale's future about to begin. Alistair stood, bruised and bloodied, his back against the stone wall of the courtyard, the once proud lord now slumped in defeat, surrounded by a circle of royal guards. His sword had long since been taken, and his haughty demeanor was gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable: fear. He was disarmed, and with it, all the power he had once wielded so ruthlessly seemed to drain away like the blood from his many wounds. Adriana's breath caught in her throat as she watched from across the yard, her heart still racing from the battle that had raged earlier. There was something undeniably satisfying about seeing Alistair brought low, but it was tempered by the knowledge of the pain and suffering his treachery had caused. She had thought him invincible, his words had poisoned the kingdom for so long, but now his fate was sealed. The clang of armor and the murmur of footsteps drew her attention to the approach of King Aemon. The king's face was etched with the weight of regret, but there was a glimmer of resolution in his step as he strode across the courtyard, his gaze fixed firmly on Alistair. He came to a halt before the traitor, his regal presence unyielding. "Alistair!" King Aemon's voice rang out low and firm, his eyes narrowing. "Your plot has failed, and so have you. You betrayed not only me, but the very kingdom you swore to serve. You shall face justice for the harm you've caused." Alistair looked up, his eyes wild with desperation, but there was no trace of the arrogance that had once defined him. He was no longer the lord who thought he could control everything from the shadows. "He was nothing now. You," Alistair began, but his words faltered as he tried to stand tall, his body shaking. "You do not understand the danger you've let slip. Highvale will fall without me." King Aemon took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "Highvale will rise again, without you. Your time has ended." With a sharp motion, the royal guards moved in, pulling Alistair away, his protests falling on deaf ears. A cheer erupted from the soldiers who had fought so long to protect the kingdom. Relief spread through the crowd like wildfire, the tension that had been built up for years finally dissipating. Adriana stood, frozen for a moment, as the weight of what had just transpired sank in. Her father had acknowledged the betrayal, the past wrongs, and in doing so had finally taken responsibility for the kingdom's future. She had never imagined this moment would come. She had fought for it, dreamed of it, but seeing Alistair led away, defeated, was a bittersweet victory. The sun began to rise higher in the sky, its rays cutting through the dissipating smoke from the battle. The kingdom had been saved, but now came the work of rebuilding. Not just the walls of the castle, but the trust that had been broken. Later that day, the grand hall of the castle had been hastily prepared for a gathering. The tapestries that had once displayed victory and grandeur now hung as reminders of the past, of what Highvale had endured and overcome. Nobles and common folk alike poured in from across the kingdom, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and hope. King Aemon stood before them, his posture strong, though his eyes carried the weight of all the years lost to Alistair's machinations. He turned to Lucian, who stood beside Adriana, no longer the silent knight she had once known, but a man who had earned his place in the world and in her heart. "Lucian," King Aemon began, his voice ringing with newfound humility. "For years I turned a blind eye to the suffering of your family. I let my pride blind me to the truth. I failed you, but no more. Today I restore to you what was once stolen." Lucian's eyes softened, and he stepped forward as his father's lands, his family's rightful place, were returned to him. It was more than just a gesture of restitution. It was a symbol of the forgiveness, of the healing that Highvale. Lucian's silence had been long, but now, it seemed, the silence was breaking, in both his heart and his home. Adriana's gaze never left him as he turned to face her, his hand brushing against hers, a quiet promise in the touch. In that moment, she realized the true depth of their bond, not just forged through battle and hardship, but through shared history, shared healing. "I accept," Lucian said, his voice steady but warm, "but not for myself alone. Highvale has been broken, but it can rise above its past. Together we will build something new." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices carrying the hope of a new beginning. The kingdom, though scarred, would heal. The pieces were coming together, not just in land and title, but in the hearts of its people. The final celebration of the day took place in the sunlit courtyard, where garlands of flowers hung from the stone walls and banners fluttered in the warm breeze. The trumpet's fanfare sounded, its bright notes cutting through the air, and the crowd gathered in anticipation. Adriana stood at the center of the courtyard, her heart fluttering in her chest. Lucian stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, his strength a steady presence. The tension that had gripped her for so long had finally lifted, replaced with a sense of peace she had never known before. A priest stood before them, his words gentle and steady as he spoke the vows of unity. There, under the fluttering pennants, with the castle and the kingdom's future behind them, they exchanged their vows. Each word they spoke felt like a promise not just to each other, but to the kingdom they now shared. Adriana's heart swelled with the certainty of what she had longed for. Lucian's gaze never wavered from hers, his eyes full of something deeper than love. Something unspoken, yet understood. They had fought for this moment, for each other, and for the future. "I promise to stand by you," she whispered, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion, "for as long as we both shall live." "And I promise," Lucian replied, his voice warm, "to stand with you, no matter what." The crowd cheered, their voices a joyous cacophony that echoed through the stone courtyard. The castle bells rang, their sweet sound filling the air, marking not just the union of two hearts, but the beginning of a new reign. A reign built on truth, on love, and on the unwavering power of unity. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the world seemed to breathe easier. The kingdom had weathered its storm, and now, with Adriana and Lucian standing side by side, the future of Highvale was brighter than it had ever been. Together they would rebuild, and together they would reign.